In late 1944, many Allied leaders believed the war in Western Europe was slowly ending. The fighting had been brutal, but progress felt steady. France was free. Belgium was mostly secure. The German border was in sight. The mood inside Allied headquarters was tired but confident. That confidence was dangerous. Winter had settled over Europe early and harshly. Snow-covered roads, fog-filled valleys, aircraft stayed grounded for days at a time. Men shivered in foxholes and dreamed of spring. Still, the front lines looked quiet. Too quiet. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, studied reports that told the same story again and again. German forces were short on fuel. Their manpower was thin. Their morale seemed broken. Intelligence officers agreed. Germany no longer had the strength to launch a major attack. The plan was patience. Hold the line, survive the winter. Push hard when the weather improved. Most commanders accepted this logic. They wanted to believe it. One area in particular looked harmless. The Ardennes forest, thick trees, narrow roads, steep hills. It had been avoided by large armies before. Even in earlier wars, it was considered poor ground for a major offensive. So the Allies placed weaker units there. New divisions, resting troops, support elements. It was not neglect. It was logic, but logic can lie. Deep inside Germany, another plan was forming. Adolf Hitler believed one bold strike could still change the war. He chose the Ardennes for the same reason the Allies felt safe there. He believed it would hide his movement. German units moved only at night. Radios stayed silent, tanks were disguised, soldiers trained quietly, fuel was saved for one moment, everything depended on surprise. While most Allied commanders dismissed the idea of a winter attack, one man did not. General George S. Patton felt uneasy. He could not explain it clearly. Reports looked calm, maps showed no obvious danger. But Patton had learned to distrust calm fronts. Silence to him often meant gathering strength. He told his staff to study the Ardennes anyway. They complained. Why plan for an attack that intelligence said would not happen? Why waste time drawing routes through forests no one expected to fight in? Patton insisted. He ordered not one plan but three. Each outlined how his army could turn north if needed. Routes, fuel needs, traffic control. Timetables, every detail. Most people never knew this work existed. On December 16, 1944, the illusion shattered. Before dawn, the eastern sky flashed again and again. German artillery opened fire across a wide front. American positions vanished under explosions. Communication lines went silent. Confusion spread faster than reports. Then came the armor. German tanks pushed through fog and snow. Infantry followed in huge numbers. American soldiers watched in disbelief as an enemy they thought was finished came rushing toward them. Units broke apart. Roads filled with retreating vehicles. Wounded men stumbled through icy fields. Officers struggled to understand what was happening. Was this a probe, a local push, or something far worse? Within hours, the truth was clear. This was a full offensive. The German attack punched deep into the Allied line. A massive bulge formed on the map. One town became critical. Bostonia, a road hub, a key junction. If it fell, the German advance could split the Allied forces in two. Eisenhower watched reports stack up on his desk. Some units were surrounded, others had vanished entirely. Weather kept aircraft on the ground. The Allies' greatest strength was useless. By the end of the day, Eisenhower faced the worst crisis since Normandy. He called an emergency meeting at Verdun. The choice of location was symbolic. Verdun had been a place of survival in the last war, now it would be again. Generals arrived through snow and wind. Inside the room, maps were covered in red arrows pointing west. Each arrow meant danger. Each arrow meant time slipping away. Eisenhower spoke plainly. This was not a raid, this was not a distraction. This was Germany's last gamble. He asked a simple question: how fast can the Allies respond? Answers were slow and careful: 6 days, maybe a week. Winter roads were bad, units were tangled in supply lines. Each estimate sounded worse than the last. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. Patton had been silent. Eisenhower asked him directly, "How soon can you attack?" Patton did not pause. 48 hours, the room froze. Some officers thought they misheard. Others shook their heads. Moving an army in winter was hard enough. Turning it 90 degrees across frozen roads sounded impossible. Eisenhower studied Patton's face. He asked again. Patton repeated the answer. 48 hours. This was not confidence. It was certainty. Patton explained why. The orders were already written. Weeks earlier, while others relaxed, he had prepared for this moment. 3 complete plans, each ready to use, each designed for a rapid turn north. Eisenhower felt something change in the room. This was not bravado. This was preparation. He made a decision that would shape the rest of the battle. He approved Patton's move. He gave Patton priority on fuel, roads, and traffic control. Everything Patton needed would come first. As the meeting broke apart, officers rushed to phones. Messages flew across headquarters. Maps were replaced. Routes redrawn. Patton stepped into the cold and began issuing orders. The Third Army would turn north, an entire army would pivot, and the clock had already started. Next, how Patton's hidden planning turned chaos into motion and why the roads themselves became the battlefield. The moment Patton left the meeting room at Verdun, the war changed direction. Literally, outside, snow blew sideways across the road. The air was sharp enough to hurt the lungs. Patton did not pause to look at the weather. He climbed into his command car and began giving orders before the door fully closed. Turn the army north. Now, inside Third Army headquarters, confusion exploded into motion. Staff officers stared at one another as phones began ringing without pause. Clerks ran with messages. Maps were pulled down and replaced with new ones. Red arrows that once pointed east were erased and redrawn pointing north. This was not a small adjustment. This was a complete reversal. Entire divisions had been preparing for their own attacks toward Germany. Camps were set. Supply dumps were positioned. Artillery was aligned for a different fight. All of that had to change in hours. Winter made everything worse. Engines struggled to start in the cold. Oil thickened, roads iced over, snow clogged narrow forest routes. Refugees and retreating units already filled many roads, creating long, tangled traffic lines. Under normal conditions, moving a single division was hard. Patton was moving 3. The key difference was this. No one was waiting for instructions to be written, they already existed. Weeks earlier, Patton had forced his staff to prepare for this exact moment. His planners had complained then. Now they understood. Each plan was labeled. Each route was mapped, each fuel requirement calculated. Patton chose the plan that best matched the weather and enemy situation. He did not debate, he executed. Orders flowed out across the army. Pack up, move north. Do not wait. Military police units were sent ahead to seize intersections. They stood in freezing winds with flags and lanterns, redirecting traffic through darkness and snow. Entire highways were cleared for Third Army movement. Fuel trucks raced forward to establish new supply points. Ammunition depots were reorganized overnight. Mechanics moved ahead of combat units to rescue vehicles that froze or broke down. Every support element shifted with the same urgency as the frontline troops. For many soldiers, the change came suddenly. One day they expected a quiet winter. The next, they were marching through snow into unknown fighting. Most did not know why, they only knew Patton wanted speed. Patton believed speed was not just movement, it was pressure. It forced mistakes, it stole time from the enemy. He repeated one order more than any other: keep moving. If vehicles stalled, push them aside. If roads clogged, find new ones. If orders were unclear, move anyway. Hesitation was the enemy. Inside his headquarters, Patton demanded updates constantly. Which units were moving? Which roads were blocked? Which fuel dumps were ready? He wanted answers in minutes, not hours. Officers learned quickly. If they did not know, Patton would find out himself. He visited units on the road whenever possible. Soldiers saw him standing in his jeep, coat flapping, binoculars in hand, scanning forward like he could see through the storm itself. That presence mattered. Men who were frozen and exhausted felt something change when they saw him. If Patton was there moving forward, then the impossible must be possible. The roads became a battlefield of their own. Trucks slid into ditches. Tanks skidded on ice. Engineers worked without rest, chopping frozen ground, laying traction, towing vehicles free. Progress was sometimes measured in yards, not miles, yet the army kept moving. Behind the scenes, the supply system was being torn apart and rebuilt. Fuel lines reversed direction. Ammunition shipments rerouted. Medical units repositioned for casualties they knew were coming. All of this happened in hours. Patton did not slow. As the Third Army pushed north, German commanders began to realize something was wrong. They expected Allied confusion. They expected delay. They did not expect a full army driving straight toward the southern flank of the Bulge. German units were forced to react. Reserves meant for pushing west were diverted south. Plans began to fray. Timetables slipped. Inside Bastogne, none of this was visible. The men there only knew they were surrounded. German artillery hammered the town day and night. Shells crashed into buildings. Snow mixed with rubble. Supplies ran low. Medical stations overflowed. The wounded lay wrapped in blankets, breath fogging the air. The famous defiant reply to surrender lifted spirits briefly, but courage did not stop hunger or cold. They waited, and time mattered. Patton knew this. Every delay on the road meant another hour of suffering inside Bastogne. He pushed harder. He demanded more. By December 21st, leading elements of the Third Army were reaching Luxembourg. Some units met German resistance immediately. Others fought the terrain more than the enemy. Still, the impossible was happening. In less than 2 days, the army had turned 90 degrees in winter under pressure. What remained was the hardest part: breaking through. Next, as Patton's spearhead closes in, Bastogne reaches its breaking point, and the race becomes a matter of hours, not days. While Patton's army clawed its way north through snow and ice, the men inside Bastogne were running out of time. The town had become a trap. Roads that once brought supplies now carried only shells and fire. German artillery never seemed to rest. Explosions echoed through the streets day and night. Buildings collapsed, trees snapped, windows shattered inward. The cold made everything worse. Snow filled foxholes, ice-coated weapons. Fingers went numb around rifle triggers. The defenders were exhausted. Most belonged to the 101st Airborne Division, supported by parts of the 10th Armored Division. They had arrived quickly with little preparation, and now they were surrounded. German forces pressed from all sides. Tanks probed weak points. Infantry attacked again and again. Supplies dwindled fast. Ammunition was counted carefully. Food was stretched thin. Medical supplies nearly vanished. Doctors worked in basements and cellars. Lantern light flickered over wounded men. Morphine ran low. Bandages were reused. Some wounded lay wrapped in blankets, their breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. Despite everything, morale did not break. The defenders believed help was coming, even if they did not know when. They trusted that someone outside the ring was moving toward them. That someone was Patton. As the Third Army advanced, resistance increased. German commanders now understood the danger. Patton's approach threatened to collapse the entire offensive. Units were rushed south to block him. Villages became strongpoints. Roads were mined. Anti-tank guns appeared at crossroads. Every mile forward became a fight. The 4th Armored Division led the push. They fought through narrow villages, across frozen fields, and up icy hills. German units resisted fiercely, knowing delay was their only hope. Patton stayed close to the front. He demanded constant updates. He pressed commanders hard. Faster, closer. Now he understood the clock. Inside Bostonia, the situation worsened by the hour. German attacks grew bolder. Artillery fire intensified. Some positions were reduced to muddy craters filled with ice and water. Men slept in short bursts. Hunger gnawed constantly. Boots froze stiff. Weapons had to be cleaned again and again to keep them working. On December 22nd, German officers approached under a white flag. They demanded surrender. They spoke politely. They believed the Americans could not last much longer. The American reply was short and defiant. It lifted spirits. It became a symbol, but symbols could not stop shells. By December 23rd, the weather began to change. Clouds thinned. The fog lifted slightly. Allied aircraft finally reached the sky. Supply drops fell around Bostonia, though many landed outside the perimeter. Still, it helped. Food arrived. Ammunition arrived. Hope arrived. But relief on the ground was still needed. Patton's army was closing in, but the final miles were the hardest. German resistance thickened. Every village fight cost time. Every delay tightened the noose around Bostonia. Patton responded the only way he knew how. He pushed harder. He visited units under fire. He stood in the cold, urging men forward. He ordered stalled vehicles moved aside without delay. He refused to let the momentum slow. The Third Army was no longer just advancing. It was racing. By December 24, the gap between Patton's spearhead and Bostonia had shrunk to a few miles. German forces sensed it too. They threw everything they had into blocking positions. Snow fell heavily. Visibility dropped. Vehicles slid and stalled. Men marched through knee-deep snow, breath burning in their lungs. Inside Bostonia, Christmas came and went without celebration. There was no warmth, no quiet, only waiting. Some defenders could hear distant gunfire that did not sound German. It was faint but different. They dared not believe. On December 25th, Patton's forces pushed closer still. Fighting raged across villages south of Bostonia. German resistance grew desperate. Units meant for the main advance west were pulled back to block Patton. This diversion mattered. Every German unit sent south weakened the main offensive. The German plan depended on speed. Patton was stealing that speed mile by mile. By early December 26, the final push began. The 4th Armored Division fought through one last village, snow-covered streets. Houses turned into fortresses. German anti-tank guns fired from close range. Infantry clashed at street corners. Then late in the afternoon, it happened. An American patrol pushed past the last German positions and crested a small rise. Ahead they saw familiar shapes. Paratroopers waving, helmets raised, arms signaling wildly. The link-up was made. The siege of Bostonia was broken. It was not dramatic. No cheering crowds, no speeches, just exhausted men staring at one another in disbelief. Supplies could flow again. Wounded could be evacuated. The defenders could finally breathe. When the news reached Patton, he did not celebrate. He simply acknowledged it and ordered the corridor widened. The job was not finished, but the moment had passed. The German gamble was failing. Next. How Patton's breakthrough shattered the German timetable, and why Eisenhower later called this maneuver the turning point of the entire campaign. The moment American forces reached Bostonia, the shape of the war changed. It did not change loudly. It changed quietly, like a weight shifting off a broken beam just before collapse. For the men inside the town, the relief felt unreal. Some had been fighting for days without sleep. Others were too weak to stand straight. When Patton's tanks appeared, many defenders simply sat down in the snow. Their bodies had nothing left to give. Supplies began moving almost immediately. Trucks rolled in with food, ammunition, medicine, and fuel. Wounded men were carried out. Doctors finally worked with light and heat. Soldiers ate hot meals for the first time in days. It did not feel like victory. It felt like survival, but survival was enough. Outside Bostonia, the fight was far from over. German forces still held high ground around the town. Artillery continued to fire. Snipers stayed active. The corridor Pat had opened was narrow and fragile. Patton knew this. Breaking the encirclement was only the first step. Now the Third Army had to hold the door open and then force it wider. German units would try to close the gap. They had no choice. Patton ordered continuous pressure. No pause, no rest, no delay. Fresh units pushed forward. Engineers strengthened roads. Artillery was brought up to support the advance. Every mile gained made the corridor safer. German commanders felt the shift immediately. Their offensive depended on speed and surprise. Both were gone. Patton's attack from the south forced them to react instead of act. Units that were meant to drive west toward the Meuse River were pulled back to defend against him. This was deadly for the German plan. Fuel shortages already plagued their armored units. Roads were clogged. Supply lines stretched thin. Now, instead of pushing forward, they were fighting to hold ground they had not planned to defend. The weather added to their trouble. As December turned toward January, skies cleared more often. Allied aircraft returned in force. German columns were attacked from the air. Fuel trucks burned. Tanks were abandoned. Movement became dangerous even during daylight. Inside Allied headquarters, the mood shifted. Only days earlier, maps had shown red arrows tearing through the front. Now those arrows slowed, bent, and finally stopped. Eisenhower and his staff watched the change with careful relief. The crisis was not over, but the collapse had been stopped. Patton's maneuver had done more than save Bostonia. It had restored balance to the entire front. Divisions that had been cut off were now reachable. Supply lines reopened. Commanders could plan again instead of react blindly. Eisenhower understood what this meant. The German gamble had failed. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower reviewed reports from the field. He read accounts of frozen marches, endless traffic jams, engineers working through nights without rest, and commanders rewriting plans hour by hour. One theme repeated again and again: speed, not reckless speed, prepared speed. Patton had not guessed, he had not hoped. He had acted on work done weeks earlier when no one else believed it was needed. Eisenhower rarely used strong praise. He believed in balance and restraint. But privately, he admitted something to his closest staff. Patton's maneuver was the most important operation of the campaign. Without it, Bostonia would likely have fallen. Without Bostonia, the German advance could have reached the Meuse. Without that, the Allied front might have broken entirely. The cost would have been enormous. Meanwhile, German commanders faced grim reality. Fuel shortages crippled movement. Armored units sat idle. Infantry lacked ammunition. Morale sank as Allied air power returned. Reports from German units grew desperate. Orders contradicted each other. Communications broke down in forests and snow-covered valleys. What had begun as a bold strike now felt like a trap. As Allied forces pressed from north and south, the bulge began to shrink. German units that had pushed forward were now in danger of being cut off themselves. The initiative had fully shifted. Patton did not slow. He kept pressing. He demanded that the Third Army continue attacking, widening the corridor and pushing German forces back. His men were exhausted, but momentum carried them forward. They knew what they had accomplished. They had turned disaster into opportunity. By early January, the German offensive was clearly failing. Tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel. Vehicles clogged roads as units tried to retreat. Entire formations dissolved under air attack. The Ardennes forest became a graveyard of steel. The Allies regained lost ground step by step. Counterattacks tightened the noose. What Hitler had hoped would force peace now drained Germany's last reserves. For Eisenhower, the lesson was clear. The battle had turned not because of luck, not because of weather, not because of numbers alone. It had turned because one commander prepared for a moment no one else expected. That preparation made speed possible. Speed made pressure possible. Pressure broke the enemy's plan. Patton's 90-degree turn did not just move an army. It moved the future of the war. Yet the story was not finished. Because while Patton drove north, another fight was unfolding elsewhere along the bulge. A fight just as desperate, just as important, and far less remembered. It was there that a small group of American tank crews faced overwhelming force and held their ground, buying time Patton desperately needed. Without that stand, the race to Bostonia might have ended very differently. Next, the overlooked battle that slowed the German advance, and the men who held the line when everything else was giving way. While Patton's Third Army pushed north and Bostonia struggled to survive, another battle was unfolding quietly on the opposite side of the Bulge. It did not involve famous speeches or dramatic relief columns. It involved cold steel, frozen ground, and a small number of American tank crews facing odds they did not fully understand. This fight mattered more than anyone realized at the time. In the early days of the German offensive, one armored route stood out as critical. If German tanks broke through here, they could move fast. Faster than Patton. Faster than Allied planners could react. This route pointed straight toward the Meuse River. For the German plan to succeed, this path had to stay open. American forces in the area were thin, many units were scattered, some were retreating. Others were still trying to understand the scale of the attack. Confusion ruled. But a handful of American armored units did not retreat. They stayed. The men inside those tanks were not told they were holding a critical position. They were simply ordered to delay the enemy. Buy time, hold as long as possible. They understood what that meant. German armored formations pushed forward with confidence. These were experienced units. They expected scattered resistance, not stubborn defense. Their orders emphasized speed. Delay was failure. Snow fell steadily as German tanks advanced along narrow roads. Engines roared in the cold air. Infantry followed close behind. Everything about the movement suggested momentum. Then they met resistance. American tanks appeared in unexpected places. Hulls were dug into frozen ground. Guns were already aimed. The first German vehicles were hit before crews fully understood they were under fire. The fight exploded suddenly. Shells slammed into armor. Smoke filled the air. Snow was thrown upward by explosions. Crews shouted inside cramped metal compartments as impacts rang like hammers. The Americans were outnumbered. They knew it. They also knew retreat would open the road completely, so they stayed. Tank crews worked with calm focus. Load, aim. Fire, adjust. They targeted lead vehicles first, blocking roads with burning wrecks. German columns slowed, then stopped. Confusion spread. German commanders pushed harder. More tanks moved forward. Infantry tried to flank through woods. Artillery joined the fight. Shells crashed around American positions, tearing trees apart and shaking the frozen earth. Still, the Americans held. Some tanks were knocked out. Crews escaped into snow and smoke, scrambling to other vehicles or joining infantry nearby. Others fought until their guns were silent. Time passed slowly. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt endless. Each moment mattered. German units began to realize they were losing something precious. Speed. Every delay here meant another hour for the Allies to reorganize. Another hour for Patton to move north. They pressed harder. American crews fought on, often without clear communication. Radios failed. Visibility dropped. Orders became simple: hold, delay, do not give ground easily. Eventually, German numbers told. Positions were overrun. Survivors pulled back or were forced to withdraw. The road was no longer fully blocked, but it was no longer fast. The damage was done. German columns that should have raced forward were now hours behind schedule. Fuel was burned in fighting instead of movement. Vehicles were damaged or destroyed. Momentum was gone. German officers sent frustrated reports up the chain. Delays here, resistance there, nothing moved as planned. At the same time, Patton's army was moving. Those lost hours mattered. While German armor struggled forward, Patton's spearhead closed in on Bostonia. The clock ticked in his favor now, not theirs. This was the hidden balance of the Ardennes campaign. Not one battle, not one hero, but time traded for blood mile by mile. The tank crews who fought here never knew how important their stand was. They were focused on survival. On their next shot, on the next command. History barely noticed them, but Eisenhower's staff did later. After the battle, reports showed that German advance schedules had slipped badly in this sector. Timetables were broken early. That disruption forced German commanders to adjust, then overadjust. Those adjustments rippled outward. Units meant to push west were delayed. Fuel allocations changed. Reserves were redirected. By the time German command realized the scale of Patton's movement from the south, it was too late. The offensive no longer moved as one. It staggered. By early January, as Allied counterattacks tightened the Bulge, the importance of these delaying actions became clearer. German armor had reached nowhere near its intended goals. The Meuse remained out of reach. The gamble had failed. For the soldiers who fought here, there were no speeches afterward, no grand recognition. Some did not survive. Others carried memories they never fully explained. They had done their job. They had held when holding mattered most. Together with Patton's maneuver and Bostonia's defense, their stand formed a triangle of resistance. Each point depended on the others. Remove one and the outcome might have changed. This is how wars turn, not in one place, not in one moment, but across many small fights that steal time from the enemy and give it to those who need it. Eisenhower later reflected on this quietly. He understood that Patton's success was not isolated. It rested on countless actions taken by men who never saw the larger picture. They only knew their orders: hold, delay, survive. As the Ardennes campaign collapsed for Germany, the Allies pushed forward with renewed strength. The front stabilized, then advanced. German losses mounted, fuel vanished, morale broke. The road to Germany opened wider each day. But behind every arrow moving east on the map was a reminder. Someone had to stand still long enough for others to move. The men who delayed the German armor did not change history alone. But without them, Patton might not have arrived in time, and Bostonia might have fallen. Next, how Eisenhower judged the entire crisis afterward, and why one decision behind closed doors mattered more than any single battle. When the German offensive finally began to fail, the change was not sudden. It happened slowly, like air leaking from a tire. One position collapsed, then another. Fuel ran short. Orders arrived late. Units that once pushed forward now struggled just to hold ground. Inside Allied headquarters, the mood shifted from fear to control. General Dwight D. Eisenhower watched the maps carefully. For days, red arrows had driven deep into Allied territory. Now they stalled, some bent backward, others stopped moving at all. This did not happen by accident. Eisenhower understood that the Ardennes crisis had turned on decisions, not chance. The weather had hurt both sides, the terrain had confused both sides, but only one side had prepared for the moment when confusion would peak. That side was the Allies, and at the center of that preparation stood one decision made behind closed doors at Verdun. Eisenhower remembered the room clearly. The tension, the silence, the weight of time pressing down on every answer. When he had asked how soon a counterattack could begin, most commanders had spoken carefully. They had measured risk. They had counted obstacles. They had been honest. But honesty alone would not save the front. Patton's answer had been different. It was not reckless. It was not hopeful. It was ready. Eisenhower later admitted that this was what convinced him. Patton did not speak like a man making a promise. He spoke like a man reading a schedule. That difference mattered. After Bostonia was relieved, Eisenhower reviewed the full picture. Reports arrived from every sector. German attacks slowed. Allied air power returned. Supply lines reopened. Morale surged. The bulge was shrinking. German commanders now faced their own crisis. The offensive that was meant to shock the Allies into collapse had drained their last reserves. Fuel was nearly gone. Tanks were abandoned. Infantry units melted away under air attack. Hitler's gamble had failed. What Eisenhower saw most clearly was this: the German plan depended on speed. Patton had destroyed that speed. By forcing German units to turn south, by stealing time from their advance, Patton had broken the enemy's rhythm. Once that rhythm was gone, the entire plan unraveled. The Allies regained the initiative. Eisenhower spoke privately with his staff. He did not boast. He did not celebrate. He analyzed. He wanted to understand why the crisis had been survived when it so easily could have ended in disaster. The answer kept returning to the same place: preparation. Patton had not guessed. He had prepared quietly, without permission, without praise. While others believed the enemy was finished, Patton assumed the opposite. That assumption saved the front. Eisenhower later told close advisors that the Verdun decision was one of the most important moments of the war. Not because it was dramatic, but because it forced action at the exact moment hesitation would have been fatal. He also understood something else. Backing Patton had been a risk. If the pivot failed, the Allies would have lost precious time and strength. Eisenhower would have carried that failure. He knew this when he gave the order. But leadership meant choosing between bad options. Standing still was worse. As January moved forward, Allied counterattacks pressed the Germans back step by step. Snow still covered the forest. The cold still punished men on both sides, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The bulge collapsed inward. German units retreated in disorder. Equipment littered roads and fields. Entire formations ceased to exist as fighting forces. Their last strategic reserves were gone. The road into Germany lay open. Eisenhower watched as the front stabilized, then advanced. He knew the war in the West was entering its final phase again, but this time without illusion. The enemy was still dangerous, but no longer capable of surprise on that scale. Later, Eisenhower reflected on how close the Allies had come to disaster. If Patton had not been ready, if the pivot had taken a week instead of 2 days, if Bostonia had fallen before relief arrived, any one of those could have changed the war's timeline, perhaps even its outcome. That knowledge stayed with him. He did not speak of it often in public, but in private writings and conversations, he returned to the same conclusion. Patton's maneuver was not just fast, it was decisive. It restored coordination to a broken front. It forced the enemy to react instead of act. It bought time where time mattered more than numbers. Time mattered more than numbers. Eisenhower did not admire Patton's personality. He often found him difficult. loud, impatient, reckless in appearance, but in this moment Eisenhower recognized something rare. Patton had combined instinct with discipline, preparation with audacity, speed with control. That combination was dangerous in the wrong hands. In this moment it was perfect. As the Ardennes campaign faded into history, many stories took center stage. The stubborn defense of Bastogne, the famous reply to surrender, the suffering of soldiers in frozen forests. Those stories mattered, but Eisenhower knew that behind them stood a quieter truth. The battle was won in a meeting room before it was won on the ground. It was won when preparation met courage, when trust met action. The 90-degree turn of the Third Army became legend. Military schools studied it, historians debated it, officers tried to understand how it had been possible. The answer was simple and uncomfortable. Someone had prepared for a disaster no one believed would come, and when it did, he did not hesitate. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, Eisenhower carried that lesson forward. He trusted preparation, he trusted flexibility, and he trusted commanders who planned for the unexpected. The war moved toward its end, but the Ardennes left a permanent mark. It proved that wars are not only won by strength, they are won by foresight. And sometimes the most important victory happens long before the first shot is fired. Next, the final reckoning, how Eisenhower remembered the crisis years later, and why Patton's quiet preparation became one of the most important lessons of modern warfare. Years after the guns fell silent, the Battle of the Bulge was often remembered as a test of endurance. Frozen soldiers, snow-filled forests, a desperate defense under impossible pressure. These images became symbols of sacrifice and resolve. But Dwight D. Eisenhower remembered something else. He remembered a room, a long table, maps covered in arrows, men struggling to speak calmly while the front collapsed. To Eisenhower, that room mattered as much as any battlefield. He had commanded coalitions before. He understood that wars were not only won by courage, they were won by coordination, trust, timing, and decisions made with incomplete information. The Ardennes crisis tested all of that. Looking back, Eisenhower understood how close the Allies had come to losing control. The German offensive had achieved surprise, communications had failed, weather had blinded air power, units had been scattered and cut off. In those first days, fear had been real, not panic but something colder, the fear of not knowing whether the front could be held at all. Eisenhower also understood that no single battle saved the situation. Bastogne mattered. The delaying tank actions mattered. Air power mattered when the skies cleared, but none of those alone explained why the line did not break. The explanation always returned to the same moment. Verdun, the day Patton said 48 hours. Eisenhower did not see that answer as arrogance. He saw it as evidence. Evidence that Patton had already done the thinking others were only beginning. That realization shaped Eisenhower's judgment more than anything else. In later conversations, Eisenhower admitted that trusting Patton had been a risk. Patton was unpredictable. He pushed limits. He angered allies and superiors alike, but Eisenhower also knew something vital. In moments of crisis, predictability could be dangerous. Patton's strength was not just speed, it was readiness. He had turned instinct into planning, planning into action, action into momentum. That chain saved time. And in the Ardennes, time was everything. German commanders never recovered from losing it. Their offensive depended on precise movement. Every hour of delay cost fuel. Every rerouted unit weakened another part of the plan. Once their timetable broke, the entire effort began to unravel. Eisenhower watched this happen. He saw German reports describing shortages. He saw Allied air attacks intensify. He saw enemy morale crack as the weather turned against them. He also saw Allied confidence return. Units that had been pushed back began advancing again. Supply lines stabilized. Commanders regained control of their sectors. The front healed. Eisenhower believed this was the true victory of the Ardennes, not just survival but recovery. The Allies did not simply endure the blow. They absorbed it and responded with strength. Patton's maneuver made that possible. In military studies written after the war, Eisenhower often emphasized this point. He argued that preparation was not about predicting exact events. It was about being ready to act when the unexpected arrived. Patton had embodied that principle. He had not known Hitler's plan, he had not known the date or the scale of the attack, but he had known that quiet fronts could be dangerous, so he prepared. That preparation changed everything. Eisenhower also reflected on leadership during the crisis. He understood that many commanders had done their best under terrible conditions. Units had fought bravely, officers had made hard choices. But he believed leadership at the highest level required something more: the ability to trust someone else's judgment. When Eisenhower approved Patton's pivot, he did so knowing he was committing the entire Allied front to that decision. If it failed, history would judge him harshly. He accepted that. Leadership, Eisenhower believed, meant owning risk. In the years after the war, Eisenhower rarely spoke publicly about his private doubts during the Ardennes. He preferred calm confidence, but those close to him knew the truth. The days after December 16th had been some of the hardest of his career. The relief of Bostonia did not bring celebration in his office. It brought relief. Deep, quiet relief. Only later did admiration settle in. Eisenhower once told a group of officers that Patton's maneuver was a masterpiece of operational warfare. For a man careful with praise, this was extraordinary. He meant it. The maneuver was not flashy. It was not dramatic in the moment. It was methodical, calculated, ruthlessly focused on time. That focus saved lives. Eisenhower also understood that Patton's success depended on thousands of others. Staff officers who worked without sleep, engineers who cleared roads in freezing darkness, drivers who pushed vehicles through snow and ice. An army moved because people believed the movement mattered. That belief came from leadership. As the war moved into Germany, Eisenhower carried these lessons with him. He encouraged planning for unlikely scenarios. He valued flexibility over rigid doctrine. He trusted commanders who prepared quietly instead of waiting for approval. The Ardennes had reshaped his thinking. When the war ended, Eisenhower returned home a hero. He later became president. His public image was calm and steady. But the soldier inside him never forgot December 1944. He never forgot the moment when disaster seemed close, when time seemed too short, when only one answer offered hope: 48 hours. To Eisenhower, that answer represented the difference between collapse and survival. It was not luck. It was not courage alone. It was preparation meeting opportunity. As historians later studied the Ardennes, many focused on dramatic moments. They wrote about snowstorms, about freezing soldiers, about famous words exchanged under white flags. Those stories mattered, but Eisenhower believed the deeper lesson lay elsewhere, in the discipline to plan for what others dismissed, in the courage to trust preparation when the moment arrived. That lesson, he believed, would matter long after the war ended, because future crises would come, fronts would collapse, plans would fail. And in those moments, the leaders who survived would be the ones who prepared in silence. Next, the final chapter: how Patton's 90-degree turn reshaped modern warfare and why this quiet decision still matters today. When the war finally ended in Europe, the Battle of the Bulge was already becoming legend. Photographs showed snow-covered forests and exhausted soldiers. Stories focused on courage, suffering, and survival. These were true stories. But they were not the whole truth. The deeper truth lived behind doors most people never saw. Dwight D. Eisenhower understood this better than anyone. Long after the fighting moved east, he continued to think about one decision. Not a charge, not a defense, a question asked in a quiet room: how soon can you attack? And the answer that followed: 48 hours. That answer did not save the Allies by itself. What saved them was everything behind it. Weeks of preparation, maps studied when others rested, plans written that no one asked for, work done in silence. Patton's 90-degree turn became famous for its speed, but speed was only the surface. Underneath was discipline, structure. A refusal to assume the enemy was finished. That refusal changed the war. Modern armies still study this moment, not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. It showed how intuition can be turned into action without chaos, how preparation can turn fear into momentum. Patton did not wait for permission to think. He did not wait for proof to prepare. When proof arrived, he was ready. Eisenhower later reflected that this readiness made all the difference. The Ardennes offensive might have split the Allied front. It might have delayed the war by months. It might have cost tens of thousands more lives. Instead, it failed. Not because Germany lacked courage, not because its soldiers stopped fighting. It failed because time ran out. Time was stolen mile by mile, hour by hour, by tank crews who delayed advances, by paratroopers who held Bostonia, by an army that turned faster than anyone believed possible, and by one decision that released that army at the right moment. Eisenhower believed this was the central lesson of the crisis: that wars are not only tests of strength, they are tests of foresight. The side that sees danger before it is obvious has an advantage no weapon can match. Patton's maneuver reshaped how modern militaries think about movement. It showed that large forces do not have to be slow. That planning does not limit flexibility. That speed and order can exist together. These ideas influenced doctrine long after the war. Commanders began to value contingency planning more deeply. They encouraged staffs to prepare for unlikely scenarios. They accepted that intuition, when backed by work, had a place in strategy. All of this came from one winter crisis. Patton himself did not reflect much on it publicly. He moved on quickly, focused on the next fight. He believed momentum should never stop. Looking back was dangerous. Eisenhower was different. He believed reflection mattered. In later years, he spoke quietly about the Ardennes. He described it as the moment the Western Front nearly slipped away. And the moment it was saved, he did not credit luck, he did not credit fate, he credited preparation, he credited trust. Eisenhower had trusted Patton's readiness when others doubted it. That trust carried risk. It also carried responsibility. But leadership, Eisenhower believed, was not about avoiding risk. It was about choosing the right risk at the right time. The 90-degree turn was that risk. It worked. As decades passed, the world changed. New wars, new technologies, new threats, but the lesson of December 1944 did not fade because crises still arrive without warning. Plans still break, assumptions still fail. And when they do, the difference between collapse and survival often depends on work done long before the crisis begins. That is the real story behind the turn, not the snow, not the tanks, not the speeches, but the quiet hours spent preparing for something no one else believed would happen. Eisenhower carried that lesson into every role he held afterward. As a leader and later as president, he valued preparation over reaction. He understood that the most important victories often come before the fight. Patton's army turned in 48 hours, history turned with it, and that is why this moment still matters, not because it was bold, but because it was ready. That readiness saved an army, it saved a front, and it helped decide the war in Western Europe.